Hello everybody, welcome to my COM505 midterm presentation, The Field of Communication Theory, a theory map using the 7 traditions by Kendra Craighead. So in my presentation, I take the 7 traditions of communication as defined by Robert Craig, and I connect them to 3 theories that I think that tradition encapsulates well. The way I did this was by using graphics to explain 4 categories of the type of communication that I think the traditions abide by, those being the processes of communication, the processes of communication, hierarchy, relationship, and cycle. And so through these categories, I pair 3 theories to each tradition as defined by Robert Craig. So, a quick overview of the 7 traditions of communication as defined by Robert Craig in his Communication Theory as a Field article in 1999. He states, in a tentative scheme of the field, rhetorical, semiotic, phenomenological, cybernetic, socio-psychological, socio-cultural, and critical traditions of communication theory are distinguished by characteristic ways of defining communication and problems of communication, meta-discursive vocabularies, and meta-discursive commonplaces that they appeal to and change. So the way he defines each tradition, begin with rhetorical, views communication as the practical art of discourse. Semiotic views communication as the mediation by signs. Phenomenological communication is the experience of dialogue with others, not to be confused with socio-psychological, which is communication as the interaction of individuals. Experiencing dialogue and the interaction of individuals are 2 different ways of viewing communication. The experience of dialogue is direct experiences, whereas socio-psychological is cognition and interaction with individuals on a psychological basis. Cybernetic is the communication, is the flow of information, and I think this is especially true of digital media. Sociocultural communication is the production and reproduction of the social order. And the critical tradition states that communication is the process in which all assumptions can be challenged. So, the first one that we're taking a look at is rhetorical tradition, the practical art of discourse. So the rhetorical tradition is about the process of communication. As you can see by the illustration on the right, it begins with communication, connection, and then result. So the 3 theories that I think fit this process of communication, connection, and result include prayer as rhetoric, interpersonal Christian prayer, and social judgment theory. Now, while prayer as rhetoric and interpersonal Christian prayer are 2 highly specific theories, I do think that they represent communication, connection, and result as a process of the rhetorical tradition. So, prayer as rhetoric, it says that prayer is a particular form of communication intended to bring a state of affairs into being through petition, praise, thanksgiving, or confession. Interpersonal Christian prayer is slightly different in that it focuses more on the relationship between the person doing the praying and the divine being that is being evoked. So instead of trying to bring about an intended state of affairs to being, this is more about the relationship in interpersonal Christian prayer. And finally, social judgment theory, the context and anchor points that determine latitude of acceptance, rejection, and non-commitment to issues. So whereas prayer as rhetoric and interpersonal Christian prayer have to do with a person and a divine being, social judgment theory has to do with 2 human actors. However, I do think that these 3 theories encapsulate rhetorical, the practical art of discourse tradition, because this tradition has to do with communicating, connecting, and enacting a result. So Pereira's rhetoric is that communication between a person and the divine being, making that connection, and then waiting for that result. Interpersonal Christian prayer is the relationship. So communicating to create a relationship, connecting through that relationship, and the result is a deeper, more spiritual life. Social judgment theory is the communication of two people, that connection between those people, and the result, whether it be acceptance, rejection, or no commitment, kind of an in-between point. So that's why I think those three theories deserve to be umbrellaed by rhetorical tradition of communication. The next is semiotic tradition of communication, which is the mediation by signs. So as you can see, the graphic on the right includes symbols. The way that I categorize the semiotic tradition is a hierarchy of communication, and I'll explain why. So as you can see in the graphic, we have a symbol, we have a meaning, we have on the left at the very bottom a social agreement, and on the right on the very bottom what this produces within society. So this hierarchy of how symbols are broken down through the semiotic tradition is why I've chosen to define it as a hierarchy. The three theories that I think encapsulate this are actor network theory, elaboration likelihood theory, and attribution theory. So actor network theory states that it's networks of people, objects, policies, and structures emerging in interaction and agency are not the property of a single person, but the collective network. So this sort of goes into that bottom left tier of my hierarchy, which has to do with agreement or social agreement. That mediation by signs in the semiotic tradition cannot have meaning unless there is a social agreement. It does not depend on one individual, but the opinions of many. So the only reason that the symbol of what is the stop sign at the very top of the hierarchy, it doesn't matter if one person thinks that that means go. What matters is the social agreement of what it means, which is to stop. Elaboration likelihood theory deals with how communicators process persuasive messages. It's a little more niche than actor network theory. Persuasive messages being maybe through news media, through propaganda. What is the elaboration likelihood theory that someone's going to process this information through their critical thinking or through less critical. So what is the sign, what does it mean, and how are we going to process this? Attribution theory, inferences and attributions about intentions, motivations are made on the basis of consistency, distinctiveness, and consensus. So that keyword there being consensus. Meanings are derived based on a consensus of what the symbol means, of what the object means, and of the meaning of words and phrases in whatever context, whatever cultural context they are occurring. So that's why these three traditions, for me, fall under hierarchy of semiotic tradition. Third, we come to the phenomenological tradition of communication, the experience of dialogue with others. So I categorize this as a cycle of communication. As you can see, the graphic on the right begins with selection, it moves down to consuming, and the final one, effect. Each of these are a cycle of one another, and the three theories I have chosen, I believe, reflect this. So uses and gratification theory, people use media for the gratification they get from it. And I have chosen very digital media heavy contextual theories for phenomenological. The next one is media equation theory, which demonstrates that we treat media as if they were human, having features and characteristics that match our own. I believe this has a lot to do with uses and gratification theory, in that we consume media based on our beliefs, based on what we think represents us or defines us. And I think that's what media equation theory is sort of getting at. Media dependency theory claims that audiences depend on media information to meet certain needs and to achieve certain goals, but an individual does not depend on all media equally. So these three theories have to do with the audience as an active participant in the media that is being consumed. So first, the media is selected. whatever factor you're going off of, whether it's gratification, whether it's what you believe represents you the most accurately, or if you're dependent on it. Whichever theory you go off of, it's a selection process. Next is it's consumed. And thirdly, it has an effect on the user. So the reason this falls under phenomenological, the experience of dialogue, is because of media equation theory that states that digital media is treated as a human being. We are in dialogue with the digital media that we consume, and that is why it has an effect on us. So that is why I believe these three theories fall under phenomenological tradition. Next, we have cybernetic, the flow of information. This tradition I defined as a process of communication, and as you can see by the graphic on my right, this is also contextualized by digital media use. So browsing preference. Everyone has a browsing preference. Everyone has a shopping preference of what they shop for, what they look for online. These things, what articles you read, these things result in cookies that save this data and use this data to sort of continually advertise similar items. So once the cookies have done that, your social media feeds become customized. And once the social media feed is customized, it will affect your perception of the world because it's tailored to yourself and your beliefs and what interests you. And this perception of the world, this reinforcement affects interpersonal communication, and so the cycle, or so the process, continues. The three theories that I believe fit cybernetic tradition are medium theory, and new medium theory, and media framing theory. These three theories all sort of play off of one another. Medium theory is about how television affects you, internet affects you, regardless of what sites you visit. And new medium theory is a little more concentrated. It's more about the second age of media, decentralized and user-generated, not just what you consume, but what you create. Media framing theory, the way that a story is put together or structured shapes the way people understand and are affected by the content. So this continual flow of information, whether it be through television, internet, through user-generated content, or through the way an article or a news story has been perceived, it is a process and flow of information that is informing perceptions of the world and therefore interpersonal communication. And that is why I chose these three theories to be umbrellaed by cybernetic tradition. Next, we have socio-psychological tradition of communication, the interaction of individuals. So my graphic on the right sort of broke down the basicness of why I have these three theories umbrellaed by socio-psychological and how cognition plays into communication. So the socio-psychological tradition is about the relationship of theories within communication. So this is a relationship. Cultivation theory is media equals reality. Cultivation theory says that heavy media consumers are more susceptible to media messages and the belief that they are real and valid. Transportation theory is media is greater than reality. It's when someone uses a story or media to sort of go away from reality, to get away, a form of escapism perhaps. Communication privacy management theory is a little different. It says that media is sort of balanced with reality, and it uses the example of relationships and how they're being managed, how their boundaries are being managed between the public and the private. So, for example, through digital media, how your relationship is perhaps portrayed on, let's say, Instagram versus what the relationship in reality is like. So it's a little bit of a balance, but sort of similar to transportation theory and what is greater than the other and how one is being used as an escape from the other. I'm just about out of time for this first recording, so I'm going to go ahead and pause here and pick up the rest of my presentation in part 2, where we will get into sociocultural. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll join you again in part 2.